Um, Today's rant is going to be about something you see in Hollywood films and TV shows all the time. And I really don't know why, because it's just so crazy. I am, of course, talking about casting swords. The most famous example is the intro to Conan the Barbarian. There's so much wrong with that intro, but the sword casting is the thing that gets me. But it's not just Conan. It's in Lord of the Rings, it's in Game of Thrones. You even see a scaled down version of the same process using pewter, I think, to cast arrowheads in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. And we all know how historically authentic that is. There's so much wrong with it that it's really hard to cover it all in one video. But I'm going to do my best. The first thing is just the logistics of the whole process. And firstly, you have to carve stone to make a mould. You literally have to take a hammer and a chisel and chip away the stone. And making it smooth and beautiful and perfect, it's really hard work. It's much easier just to forge out some steel. But that aside, let's look at the actual process of moulding. Oh God, my hands have come out. Started to get uptight now. When you're casting metal, and this is something I've done quite a lot, then what you do is you create an enclosed mould so that you have a negative three-dimensional shape within the mould into which you pour the molten metal. And you need a number of things to happen. You need for the mould to be able to be disassembled so you can take the piece out, assuming you're planning on using the mould more than once. And if it's made of stone, then you almost certainly are. If you're making a mould out of chalk or plaster of Paris or something along those lines, then you may not want to use it more than once. If you're using sand, that's fine. You don't have to use the mould more than once. But if you're using stone, it's because you want to use it more than once. There are examples of hand-carved stone moulds in the Museum of London for small pewter things, pilgrim badges, belt buckles, spoons, that kind of thing. Oddly enough, there aren't any for swords. And even if there were, they wouldn't be just a trough carved out of stone, completely open on the top. Because when you pour liquid metal into that, and for this, we're going to have to assume that metal stays liquid, stays fluid enough to be able to be cast and to flow throughout the whole mould. And it won't, by the way, because stone acts as a heat sink. But assume that the metal stays hot enough and fluid enough that it fills the mould completely. What you then end up with is a sword shape on the bottom and a completely flat surface on the top. And that's just ridiculous. That's not a sword. It's not even really a sword-like object. It's at best half a sword, and you'd have to cast two and then somehow stick them together to form one massive, heavy, clunky sword. Or you'd have to take your raw steel out of the mould and then forge it into a sword shape anyway. And if you're going to do that, why bother melting the damn stuff to start off with? God. Now, let's look at the actual metallurgy of what's going on. The logistics, clearly, we know the logistics are all wrong. But let's look at the actual process. Now, bronze, copper alloys, cast really nicely, as does pewter. Steel, on the other hand, doesn't. Now, we're just going to, a quick intermission here to talk about the metallurgy of steel. Steel is iron, an element, and carbon, another element, mixed together. Put the two together, you get steel. The proportion of carbon to iron is really, really important. if you're using metal that has 0.5% carbon to iron, then you'll get something that will make a half-decent blade. That will harden. It won't be massively hard. For that, you're looking at maybe 0.8. That would be a lovely steel to work. It would work nicely under the hammer. And when you finished, you could quench it and it would harden, so you'd have a resilient blade. 0.3% carbon in your steel, and that will not happen. It'll work beautifully under the hammer, but you won't be able to harden it. Now, one of the interesting things about steel is that it pours really badly. If you melt it and try and pour it, it won't pour. It's crap. And one of the best ways to make steel pourable is to dramatically step up the amount of carbon in the material. So you're looking at 2%, 3%, sometimes even higher. And that produces a liquid that flows beautifully and makes fantastic shapes. When you see cast iron railings, you see cast iron firebacks, frying pans, skillets, that kind of thing, they're made from cast iron. And the name is deceptive because it's not iron, it's steel. It's incredibly high carbon steel. The carbon content is so high that if you tried to forge it, it would crumble away. And it's incredibly brittle. If you drop a cast iron skillet onto a stone floor, the chances are the skillet will smash. It's so brittle that you cannot work it. And it's also so brittle that it would be a terrible sword. If every time you hit anything with your sword, it shattered, you'd get through swords really quickly, or, more likely, you'd just die. So, what you have then is a material that's terrible for swords being used in a process that's terrible for making swords in order to make a sword. So why do they do it? I'm guessing because it looks good.
I'll be too busy looking good.
And it only looks good if you're an idiot. When steel gets hot, it changes colour. To start off with, you get a colour that's known as black red, which seems to be a bit of a contradiction in terms, but bear with me. In sunlight or normal natural light, it would appear to be black, but if you took it in the dark, you'd see that it was just beginning to glow slightly, a dark red, right inside. It's a really pretty thing to see. From then it becomes cherry red, and then orange, and then yellow, and then white, and it starts to spark, and eventually it will start to melt, and it bubbles and melts. It doesn't melt nicely because it doesn't have a high carbon content, just like we said. But by the time steel is able to be poured, it is literally incandescently white. You wouldn't even be able to look at it. But when you see it being poured in films, in TV shows, it's always orange. Now, interestingly, things glow at temperatures, and that's pretty consistent whether it's steel or stone or the inside of the forge or the crucible that you're pouring the steel from. It doesn't matter what it is. As a general rule of thumb, if something is glowing orange, it's a specific temperature. If it's glowing white, it's a hotter temperature. So when something is liquid at an orange heat, the one thing you know it isn't is steel. Lead alloys, such as pewter, don't glow at all before they melt. They pour and they're still shiny white metal. Mercury is liquid at room temperature. So what the producers have done when they're putting this together is they've looked at their sword making process and thought, I know what would be cool. Let's pour liquid metal in. And someone has said to them, yeah, you can't do that. That wouldn't work. And they go, well, it doesn't have to be steel. We could use something like aluminium. That melts and that glows beautifully orange. Nobody would ever know. Wrong. We know, and we think you're an idiot. Stop doing it. It doesn't look good. It's not big. It's not clever. It's just stupid.